My wife cheated with my family's accountant. They stole my inheritance while I mourned my parents. But I recorded her confession, and now they're both going to prison. I'm 31 years old, work in real estate, and I need to get this story off my chest because what happened a few months ago basically destroyed everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about love, and about trusting people. I guess I should start at the beginning, when I met Rebecca in college, because that's where it all started, though obviously I had no idea what was coming. I met Rebecca when we were like 20 years old. I was in my third year of college and she had just transferred from another school. We met at a party, one of those typical college parties where everyone's half drunk and the music is so loud you have to yell to be heard, you know? She was amazing. I mean, she wasn't just pretty, which she was, but there was something else, like an energy she had, a way of talking that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. And what I liked most, honestly, was that when I told her my family had money, that there was a trust fund and all that, she kind of shrugged and changed the subject. She asked me about what I was studying, about my plans, about my hobbies, and that blew my mind because basically every girl I dated before got super interested as soon as I mentioned the money. My parents created the trust fund when I was little, like I was 8 or 9 years old. My father had built a pretty successful business, something related to technology and investments. I'm not going to lie and say I completely understood what he did, but I do know he did very well. My mother came from money too. Her family had properties and businesses from before I was born. So, when I was old enough to understand, they explained to me that there was a trust fund in my name, that it would be available when I reached a certain age, and that in the meantime, Stephen, the family accountant, would be the administrator or trustee or whatever it's called. Basically, he managed everything and made sure the money was invested correctly and stuff like that. Stephen. I had worked with my family for years, I think since I was like 5 years old, so he basically grew up with me in a certain sense. He was like the weird uncle of the family who showed up at Christmas dinners and always brought expensive but impersonal gifts, you know what I mean? He wasn't emotionally close, but he was always there, always reliable, always doing his job. My father trusted him completely, and when my parents wrote their will and updated the trust fund, Stephen was still the administrator because, well, why not? He'd been loyal for decades. But let's get back to Rebecca. We became boyfriend and girlfriend like 2 months after meeting, and it was one of those relationships that feels perfect from the beginning, you know, where there's no drama, where everything flows naturally. She came from a middle-class family. Her father was a teacher and her mother a nurse. And I always liked that about her, that she came from a more humble but hardworking place, with solid values. When I took her to meet my parents, they loved her. My mother especially. She said, Rebecca was different from all the others, that she was genuine, that she wasn't with me for the money, but because she really loved me. We graduated, got jobs, I went into real estate, and she went into marketing for a medium-sized company. And 2 years into being together, I proposed to her. It was on a beach. Nothing super elaborate but special for us, and when she said yes, I swear I thought I was the luckiest man in the world. We got married the following year, a nice but not extravagant wedding, like 150 people, in a garden, all very elegant, but not ostentatious, because neither of us was that style. After the wedding, my parents did something I'd been expecting, but that still surprised me when it actually happened. They added Rebecca as a beneficiary to the trust fund. It wasn't that she could access the money directly, but if something happened to me, she was covered. My father pulled me aside. The day they signed the papers and told me, "Take care of her, Chris. She's a good woman," and I promised him I would, that I'd spend the rest of my life making her happy. The first years of marriage were good, normal, I guess. We both worked a lot, bought a house together. Well, technically the trust fund helped with the down payment, but we paid the mortgage with our salaries. Adopted a dog, took trips, had our routines. It wasn't perfect. We had our arguments like any couple, but nothing serious, nothing that made me think something was wrong. And then everything changed when my parents died. First it was my mother, a brain aneurysm out of nowhere. She was 58 years old and completely healthy until one day she just collapsed and never woke up. That was devastating, obviously, but what came after was worse. My father couldn't handle it, literally. He couldn't live without her. He started deteriorating, stopped eating well, stopped taking care of himself, and 6 months later he had a massive heart attack and also passed away. It was like his body had simply given up because his heart had already left with my mother. This was like 2 years ago. Rebecca and I had been married for 7 years, and I can honestly say she was my rock during that time. She was with me at all the funerals, took care of things I couldn't handle because I was too devastated, organized the meals after the service, talked to people when I couldn't, and at night when I cried like a child, she hugged me and told me everything was going to be okay. I literally thought, how lucky am I to have a wife like this, someone who loves me so much she's willing to carry my pain. After my parents died, obviously everything with the trust fund and the inheritance had to be sorted out. Stephen took care of everything. Or so I thought, did all the necessary transfers, updated the documents, explained to me how everything was going to work now that I was the only living beneficiary besides Rebecca. There was a lot of money. I'm not going to give exact figures, but enough that I'd never have to work another day in my life if I didn't want to. But I kept working because I liked my job. I liked having my own career, my own identity, beyond being the rich guy with the trust fund. Things continued relatively normally for a while after that. A few months, maybe 8 or 9 months after my father died, Rebecca and I talked about having children, about buying a bigger house, about taking a long trip through Europe. We'd always planned. And then one day I got home from work. It was a Friday. I remember perfectly because I'd bought Chinese food on the way. That place Rebecca loved. And when I walked into the house, she was sitting in the living room with a suitcase next to her. I stood there like an idiot, holding the bag of food, and asked her what was happening, if she was going somewhere, if she had a work trip or something. And she looked at me with a completely cold expression I'd never seen on her face before, and told me, "I'm leaving, Chris. This is over." Just like that. No preamble. No explanation. Just that. I tried to approach, to ask her what was happening, what I'd done wrong, but she raised her hand and told me, "Don't touch me." And in that moment, I knew something was very, very wrong. She told me she'd been having an affair, that she'd met someone else, someone who made her feel things I'd never been able to make her feel. I literally felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't process what I was hearing. I asked her who it was, how long this had been going on, and she told me, "With Stephen, we've been seeing each other for 2 years." And that's when my brain just short-circuited, because Stephen, the Stephen who managed my trust fund, the Stephen I'd known practically my whole life, the Stephen who was married and had a young daughter. I asked her if she was pregnant, if that's why she was leaving, and she laughed. She laughed in my face and told me no, that she'd never wanted to have children with me anyway, that was just something she told me to keep me happy. She told me she was moving in with Stephen, that he was going to leave his wife, and that basically I was pathetic, and she was tired of pretending she loved me. I don't know what happened after that. Honestly, it's all blurry. I think I sat on the floor, or maybe I just stood there. I don't remember well. She grabbed her suitcase and left. Just like that, closed the door, and I was left alone in a house that suddenly felt huge and empty and completely alien. The dog came and sat next to me, and I remember I hugged him and cried into his fur for I don't know how long. The following days were a fog. I called work and said I was sick, which wasn't a lie because I literally felt physically sick. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I just lay in bed wondering what I'd done wrong, how I hadn't noticed, how the person who'd been by my side for 9 years could be a complete stranger. And then, like a week after Rebecca left, someone knocked on my door. It was nighttime, like 8 or 9, and when I opened it, there was a woman standing there I didn't recognize at first. But then I realized it was Nicole, Stephen's wife. We'd never been close. I'd seen her at some social gatherings related to Stephen's work. But that was it. She looked terrible, had red eyes like she'd been crying, and asked me if she could come in. I said yes, obviously, and we sat in the living room, and she basically confirmed what Rebecca had told me, that Stephen and Rebecca had been having an affair. But then Nicole told me something I didn't expect at all. She told me it wasn't just an affair. that Rebecca and Stephen had been stealing money from my trust fund, that they'd been diverting funds for months, maybe more than a year, and that she had proof. I couldn't believe it. I mean, the affair was already horrible enough, but this was another level completely. Nicole showed me bank statements, emails she'd found on Stephen's computer, documents showing strange transfers from my trust fund to accounts I didn't recognize. She told me Stephen had been using his position as administrator to basically steal from me, and that Rebecca had been helping him, providing him with information, coordinating things, being his accomplice in everything. I asked Nicole how she'd discovered all this, and she told me she'd started suspecting when Stephen started acting weird, coming home late, being secretive with his phone, and one day she checked his laptop when he was in the shower and found everything. She told me that when she confronted him, he confessed everything. The affair with Rebecca, the plan they'd had from the beginning, everything. And then Nicole told me the most twisted part of this whole story. She told me that according to what Stephen had confessed to her, Rebecca had intentionally sought me out in college, that she knew who I was, knew about my family and the money, and that everything had been calculated from the beginning. That the reason she acted like she didn't care about the money when we met was precisely to make me trust her, to make my parents trust her, and add her as a beneficiary to the trust fund. Nicole told me that Rebecca and Stephen had been planning all this for years, waiting for the right moment, and that when my parents died, they saw their opportunity. Stephen had complete access to the trust fund. He could make transfers, he could create fake accounts, and with Rebecca as an official beneficiary, they had the perfect cover. If anyone asked, they could say the transfers were for Rebecca, which technically was within her rights as a beneficiary. I felt like the biggest idiot in the universe. My entire relationship with Rebecca, 9 years of my life, 7 years of marriage, everything had been a lie. She'd never loved me. She'd just been patiently waiting for my parents to die so she could execute her plan. With Stephen, and I, like a complete imbecile, had fallen for everything. Nicole told me she wanted to sue them, both of them, for fraud, for embezzlement, for everything that could stick. She told me she was a lawyer, that she worked at a large firm specializing in financial litigation, and that if I agreed, she could take my case in addition to hers. She told me that Stephen hadn't just stolen from me, but had also been using money from his own family to finance his affair with Rebecca, buying her things, paying for hotels, all with money that should have been for Nicole and their daughter Maya. I told her yes, obviously, to do whatever she had to do, to sue them, to destroy them, that I didn't care. I was furious, angrier than I'd been in my life, and I just wanted them to pay for what they'd done. Nicole told me she needed time to gather all the evidence, to build a solid case, and that in the meantime I shouldn't contact Rebecca or Stephen to let them think they were getting away with it. Like 2 weeks passed, and during that time, Nicole and I worked together to review everything. I gave her access to all my trust fund documents, to all the account statements, to everything I had, and she hired a forensic accountant to review everything and identify exactly how much money they'd stolen. It turned out to be an absurd amount. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars. They'd diverted to offshore accounts, to fake investments, to all kinds of elaborate schemes. Nicole was incredible at all this. Honestly, super professional, super organized. She knew exactly what to do and how to do it. We spent hours in her office reviewing documents, preparing statements, and in those weeks I got to know her better. She told me about her daughter, Maya, who was like 3 or 4 years old, and how all this was affecting her. How Maya asked why Daddy didn't live at home anymore. Why Mommy cried all the time. And then Rebecca contacted me. She sent me a text message, saying she needed to talk to me, that she'd made a mistake, that everything with Stephen had been a confusion, and that she really loved me. I showed Nicole the message and she basically told me not to respond. But Rebecca kept insisting, sending me messages, calling me, leaving me voicemails where she cried and told me she missed me, that she wanted to come back. Nicole and I came up with a plan. I was going to agree to see Rebecca, but I was going to carry my phone recording in my pocket. I was going to try to get her to confess about the money, about the plan with Stephen, everything. So, I responded to Rebecca, and we agreed to meet at a public cafe, a neutral place where I could feel safe. When I saw her arrive at the cafe, For a second, just 1 second, my heart skipped a beat because she looked like the Rebecca I'd fallen in love with years ago. But then I remembered everything she'd done, and that feeling evaporated. We sat down. She ordered a latte, her favorite drink, and started with her speech about how she'd been confused, that Stephen had manipulated her, that it was really me she loved. I let her talk, nodded in the right places, acted like I was considering giving her another chance. And then, very casually, I mentioned the money. I said something like, "Hey, I was reviewing the trust fund statements and there are some transfers I don't understand. Do you know anything about that?" And she, without hesitation, told me yes, that Stephen had made some investments in my name, not to worry about it, that everything was handled professionally. I asked her if she'd participated in those decisions, if she'd been involved, and she got nervous, started changing the subject. But I insisted, said I just wanted to understand, that if we were going to be together again, I needed total transparency. And then she told me, basically told me yes, that she'd helped Stephen with some things, that they'd moved some money but it was to invest it better, to make it grow, faster, and that I was going to thank her when I saw the returns. All this was being recorded on my phone. Every word, every admission. I asked her more questions, trying to get her to be specific, and she kept talking, probably thinking that if she convinced me everything had been for my benefit, I was going to forgive her and let her come back. I asked her directly, "So, you knew Stephen was moving money from my trust fund without my permission," and she said yes, but that it wasn't theft because technically it was my money and I was eventually going to get it back with interest. When we finished talking, she tried to take my hand and told me she loved me, to please forgive her, that we could get through this together. I pulled my hand away and told her I needed time to think, and she told me she'd wait, that she'd do whatever was necessary to get me back. I left that cafe feeling a mixture of satisfaction and nausea. Satisfaction because we had the confession we needed, and nausea because I just confirmed that everything, absolutely everything with Rebecca, had been a lie. I gave the recording to Nicole, and she basically lit up, told me this was gold, that with this we could bury them legally. And that's exactly what we did. Nicole filed the lawsuits, both mine against Rebecca and Stephen, and hers against Stephen. And she also reported everything to the corresponding authorities because what they'd done wasn't just grounds for a civil lawsuit but also possibly criminal. But Nicole didn't stop there. She is, as I'm telling you, absolutely brilliant and a bit vindictive in the good sense. She contacted the company where Rebecca worked and sent them copies of all the evidence, showing them that their employee had been involved in financial fraud and embezzlement. Rebecca was fired immediately. They threw her out without any kind of severance or benefits. When Rebecca found out we'd sued her and that she'd lost her job, she went completely crazy. She sent me furious text messages, called me screaming, saying I'd betrayed her, that she'd truly loved me and I'd destroyed her. The irony was so absurd I almost laughed. Almost. I changed my number after that because I didn't want to keep receiving her messages. Stephen was arrested. The authorities determined there was enough evidence for criminal charges of embezzlement and fraud, and they arrested him at his office, in front of all his colleagues, which according to Nicole was particularly satisfying to see, although she wasn't there physically, but they told her the details. Rebecca used all the money she had left, everything she'd managed to steal and hide, to pay Stephen's bail, which meant she was now basically bankrupt. Things got ugly after that. Stephen would show up at Nicole's house sometimes, drunk, yelling, blaming her for having reported him, for having ruined his life. Once he showed up when Maya was awake, and the poor girl was traumatized, crying and hiding behind Nicole while Stephen banged on the door and yelled incoherent things. Nicole had to call the police and get a restraining order. I started spending more time with Nicole and Maya after that incident. Nicole was obviously stressed, trying to handle everything. The divorce, the lawsuits, her job, and taking care of Maya, who now had nightmares and trouble sleeping. I didn't have much else to do. Honestly, my work was basically on autopilot and I had no other obligations, so I offered to help. I'd stay some nights at Nicole's house, sleeping on the couch, just so she'd feel safer in case Stephen showed up again. I'd play with Maya, help her with her drawings, read her stories before bed, and slowly the girl started to trust me, to see me as someone safe. Nicole told me she could never thank me enough, that I didn't have to do any of this, But the truth is, it helped me too. It gave me a purpose. It distracted me from my own pain. The first court hearing was like 2 months ago. Nicole and I showed up with mountains of evidence, account statements, recordings, emails, testimonies from forensic experts, everything. Rebecca and Stephen arrived with mediocre lawyers who clearly couldn't compete with the firm where Nicole worked, and that she'd managed to get to take the case with full resources. It was surreal to see Rebecca and Stephen there, sitting together at the defense table, trying to look composed but clearly terrified. The judge reviewed the preliminary evidence and basically told them things didn't look good for them, that there would be additional charges, that the best thing they could do was start thinking about some kind of settlement. But Rebecca and Stephen refused to reach a settlement. I think they still thought they could get out of this somehow, that they could convince a jury everything had been a misunderstanding. Their lawyers tried to argue the transfers had been authorized, that as a beneficiary, Rebecca had a right to certain funds, but Nicole tore them apart, presented the recording where Rebecca admitted she knew they were moving money without my permission, presented evidence of the offshore accounts they'd opened, presented everything. Right now they're waiting for the full trial, which should be in a few months, but everyone already knows how it's going to end. Rebecca and Stephen don't have money for good lawyers because they spent everything on bail and trying to hide assets. They don't have jobs because they were both fired, and they have mountains of legal debts piling up. And most likely, they'll end up in prison for several years, in addition to having to return all the money they stole plus damages. Nicole told me last week that Maya has been asking if her daddy is going to come back someday. She told her the truth, adapted for her age obviously, that daddy did bad things and has to go to a special place for a long time. Maya thought for a moment and then looked at me and asked if I was going to stay. If I was going to keep reading her stories at night. I told her yes, that I'd be there as long as they needed me. And that's enough for now, I guess.